Good afternoon, Craig from Prime Ag. This afternoon, we are going to talk about the 2025 feeder cattle market. As we move into our first slide here, we have the weekly chart for the 2024-2025 feeder cattle. A couple things I'd really like to point out on this. When we look at our 2024 high, we're at 267.87. And today when I walked in here to record this webinar, front month feeder cattle were trading over 370. Something we have to look at, when we started the feeder cattle market for November back in January 2nd, we closed at 265. We're up over $100, $105 for the trading range for 2025. We look back at that compared to some other years, in 2019, we had a trading range of $25. And just in the last week alone, we've had a trading range of $18. So we do just have a lot more volatility in these markets, and they can move a lot faster than they have in the past. When we look at this market from 2025, we have to look at some of the news that made this market move. Strong consumer demand. Whether you go to your local Texas Roadhouse, or your local steakhouse, there seems to be a wait on the weekends because people want to eat beef. I was visiting with someone at the butcher shop this last weekend when I was in there. They keep telling me that the premium meats they cannot keep in the shelves, and they're always disappearing. The biggest thing that helped move this market are two things. One is we have a historically low herd. We had our lowest herd in 70 years. We just have low cow numbers. And in turn, we just don't have the fed cattle numbers that we do in the lot. And with these high prices, more people are feeding heifers and not retaining them. So going forward, one thing that we want to look into, or we have to look about, in the feeder cattle market, is herd retention or growing the herd. We look at herd retention. The biggest thing that we look at is a couple different things. Is first of all, the average age of the rancher is 60 years, if not older. Do they have anybody coming back to take over the ranch, or are these ranches just start to get smaller and no one's going to take them over? The second thing is the infrastructure on the cattle side, or the cow-calf side of it is, you drive around any part of the country, especially you get in these areas, the fringe areas of the Corn Belt or whatever you want to call them. There's just been a lot of pastures where the fences have been ripped down and the pastures have been planted to corn or soybeans or other crops. It just takes a long time to reestablish these pastures and get these fences back up. And also on top of that, if you're using heifers to grow the herd, we're looking at 18 months by the time you get them bred and you have a calf to put in the feedlot. The last thing that really moved this market is the Mexican border. We had the screwworm, and in November of 2024, they closed that border and stopped 100,000 head coming across daily. We did open it up a couple different times, I believe, but it was both closed immediately right away, and not many head came across. When we look at those, would be our positive/bullish, items that we look at in the feeder cattle market. When we move into, the negative or bearish items, we have to look at the Mexican border, or the screwworm, vaccine with the Mexican border. A vaccine was approved on September 30th, and the border by the FDA, and the border probably will be opening soon, and those 100,000 head will be coming across. Another thing that, on the national news right now, they're talking about the high cost of meat for consumers. It just seems whenever we have national news in the ag sector, the market always moves in the opposite direction of what they're talking about. So, when they talk high beef price, it just seems like, the cattle markets or whatever markets are, they talk about moving the opposite direction of what they are. The one even market, or one thing that, we're seeing right now is box beef and cash cattle are steady, so that'd be more neutral to the market right now. The one thing we do know is we did have very, very strong margins on these cattle. And when you look at managing risk on feeder cattle, LRP is one way to do it. And I do all the insurance in the office. Or if you want to look in the calls and puts or options and, futures trading, you'd have to talk to one of our brokers. I am not able to do that. Now in this feeder cattle example, this is just one example, for informational purposes only. On this one here, we're looking at, 800-pound feeder steers that we're going to ship in April. When we look at these, you can put in a 360 floor or $2,878 per head floor on these. It'll cost about $124. When we go down to the 90% level, we're looking at 324 floor, a $25.90 per head. That's going to cost you $42 per head. The one thing we want to remind producers on the feeder cattle is you don't have to sell the cattle. You have to own or sell them within 60 days of the end date on these. If you're negative or bearish on this, we recommend buying a higher level on the feeder cattle LRP. If you're positive, bullish, and want to lock in a floor, buy a lower level and don't spend as much money. A lot of producers at this point too are saying, "Hey, this is great. I did something for my 2025 cow crop or calf crop. What should I do for 2026?" I brought a quick looked up a winter quote. Of taking cattle to 600 pounds in next September, we're looking at protecting a $2,000 animal for about $57. We bring this chart back in that we started with, and we just want to talk about margins here. When we look at the cost of annually keeping a cow, it's anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500, and the cost to take a calf to 800 pounds is $500. So we're looking at between $1,500 and $2,000, to get that calf to market at 800 pounds. So when you look at this here, you can do a 340 floor, and it's going to give you a guarantee of $2,700 and $20 per head. At 300, it's a $2,400 guarantee. If you want to look at a $1,750 average, get that calf to market, these are just strong margins. The thing that we want to remind people on this chart is, it's all about margin. Margin, margin, margin. That's where your dollars and your profit come from. Price can disappear in a hurry. If you lock in targets, don't fret over a $5 move or you're not quite close enough. A $5 move is only a $40 per head swing. Keep the good times rolling. We've had good times. Let's keep these margins going into 2026. It's okay to be wrong, and we will be wrong. One of our favorite parts of our report is we have a lot of people like our Herd in the Country. And here's one I talked to a producer last year, back in February 1st. These margins on these market heifers for September at 100% coverage is too good to pass up. We've never received over $1.95 for fat cattle. I doubt they can go much higher. Sign me up. They also mentioned they had high margins at that time at that level. Back to mid-September, I was hauling in the cattle we LRP'd back in February, right after we got the bill, and was frustrated to have to pay an $83 per head bill. We got the check in the mail and realized live cattle could be down from the $195 guarantee of instead selling for $240. Risk management is about maintaining profitable margins, not being right or wrong. I thought that was a very good point that he made. He made extra money, and strong margins on those cattle. As we look into, if you have need any more information or more specific to your operation, don't be afraid to contact us. You can call or text me at any time at 262-707-4112. Thanks for your business. Have a safe and successful harvest. The big thing I want to remind people is, we're all very busy and we get too wrapped up in our days. Don't forget to take the time to spend time with family and friends during these busy season. It's always, important to do that also besides working all the time. And, we got to remember all the, the good times do go too fast. We're heading to our last cattle show here next week with my daughter. And, we've been doing it for over 12 years and the times do go really fast. So, make sure to take time to spend time with your family too. Thanks and have a great day.